You're listening to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, a podcast that explores what matters most to business. I'm your host, Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. Let's get talking. Welcome back, everybody. You may remember that we spent last week's episode talking broadly about workplace safety and what exactly the state government's role is in regulating that area, specifically as it pertains to the advancing House Bill 1054. Well, we're going to dig a little deeper into that topic today, but we're going to narrow the scope of the conversation from workplace safety as a whole to workplace safety that is focused on those employers who have employees working outside when it's quite hot or it's quite cold. And for today's conversation, we have State Representative Meg Froelich, a Democrat from Greenwood Village, who's one of the primary sponsors of House Bill 1272, which is scheduled for its first committee hearing on Wednesday. The bill in general seeks to have the state collect data about the number of workplace injuries that occur during more extreme weather conditions, and then have that data be used to put together model temperature-related injury and illness prevention plans from the perspective of both the state and the individual employers. Representative Froelich, welcome to Colorado Chamber Office Hours.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I typically give a fuller description of what a bill does to start these conversations, but I know there are a lot of talks that remain ongoing about what exactly this bill will seek to do. So at this point, I think it's better for me to ask you, Representative Froelich, what will the bill seek to do when it's presented to the committee on Wednesday?
Well, thanks again for the question. Thanks for the conversation. Really, broadly, what the bill is doing is addressing this confluence of events. We have actual climate change. We have these extreme temperatures. So in Colorado, and of course we've had an unusual February going into March where we've just seen climate change in action. It can cause extreme cold. It can cause extreme heat. So we have folks on roofs at 115 degrees where we used to think that only happened in Arizona. So climate change is real. It's here, and our workers are being affected. At the same time, the federal government is dismantling a lot of worker protections. So OSHA, the federal agency that oversees worker protections, is basically being devolved. And they entered into many years worth of discussions on how to protect workers in extreme temperatures and the kind of how to work product. New administration, that all went away. So the question is, well, like so many ways in which we're called upon to react to federal action, what can we do in Colorado? What's appropriate? How can we keep people, and in this case, workers in extreme temperatures, safer and safeguard their health and well-being? So last session, we introduced a bill that was incredibly prescriptive, set the business community on fire. And I think that was an interesting and worthwhile discussion because that bill was informed by workers' experiences. And to be frank, probably some bad experiences and distrust of employer to employee. So the bill ended up being incredibly prescriptive because of that inability of those two, the employers and the employees, to really get on the same page on a whole host of things. So when it was proposed that, for example, water breaks be scheduled in extreme heat, I think the workers were distrustful that there wouldn't be a situation where employers would point to a horse trough and be like, have at it. You can get your break. So we came into the interim wanting to work on this issue and understanding that was the previous bill was not the way to go, and that the only way we were really going to go forward was to come together with employers and employees and make the case for why healthy workers were better for the business community in the long run, and why the business community would not be harmed by acknowledging the climate realities and extreme temperatures and keeping their workers safe. So this bill, the first part, as you described, is really trying to make the case that this is a problem and that workers are being harmed. And if, as we heard pushback last year, if it isn't a problem and if workers aren't being harmed, I guess that will be proven as well through this data collection period. The other thing we heard from business community was, in addition to the bill being too prescriptive, was that it was burdensome for them to have to come up with these emergency plans, what we're calling trips. So we asked, in working with CDLE, the Department of Labor, could they do a kind of trip in a box, an emergency plan in a box, and sort of provide that to businesses that didn't already have these emergency plans. So coming into this session, we tried to make the bill less burdensome on business, more collaborative, acknowledging that a lot of industries are doing this. They do have emergency plans. I mean, obviously, if you're ski country USA, you've got people working outside all the time below 30. And you have all sorts of emergency provisions in place for when that happens. Also, if you're construction and you're in the high country, you're seeing more hot days. Even in the mountains, we're now seeing temperatures over 100, which was, previously sort of unheard for. But we're also obviously seeing the extreme cold. And so that's the first part of the bill. The second part of the bill contemplated all the things that CDLE could do in terms of rulemaking to really focus in on the aspects that were removed from the bill before being too prescriptive. So, what is extreme cold? What is extreme heat? What's appropriate in terms of um, work breaks or shade breaks or water breaks or heating breaks? And how does that really play out across industries? Obviously, there are many variations as there are industries. So to really let CDLE sort of take the data and talk with industry, because rulemaking tends to involve industry pretty heavily. They do tend to, when interacting with a department, get an opportunity to chime in and be heard. Um, if anything, we feel like workers aren't heard in the rulemaking process, so we thought that that was a fairer way to approach it by industry.
For employers who are listening to this, what is going to be their responsibility if this bill passes?
So I should say first, we did choose to introduce a very robust vision, a multi-year plan that does get us to a place where eventually all industries and all employers have in place these emergency plans. It's many years down the road. The bill that we will eventually end up with will be this first part, and it's very non burdensome for industry. So they do not have to submit any data, they do not even have to submit their current plans, which we contemplated at one point. Um, all that first phase will be is collecting existing data from workers' comp, from extreme temp organizations, and then the CDLE making this trip in a box or this model trip.
And I think a lot of businesses would even say, okay, collecting data is one thing, but what do you do with that information? I think that's where some people start to get a little worried. And so I guess the question is, do you expect the data you collect to lead to more regulations in this area? Do you expect it to lead just to these best practices? Is it information for information's sake?
In some ways, we feel like we're on a little bit of an uphill battle because we've had workers come say their experiences over and over again, and it remains dismissed as anecdotal. So, one piece of it is we hope that the data shows that this goes beyond stories of workers coming to the Capitol and sharing their stories, and that it is borne out in data. Both, I mean, we want the raw data just in terms of what our climate is doing to Colorado now. Just how many days are we over 100 and how many days are we under 10? But also from workers' comp information and from hospital visits, how often are workers harmed in those extreme temperatures? So, yes, then what do you do with it? So, is it even happening? We feel like that's an important part of the narrative because our workers have been dismissed as complaining or unrealistic or whatever that is, or in an extreme minority or exaggerating or a whole host of things. So, hope to really get a accurate snapshot of what it looks like to be an outdoor worker in a hot summer day. And then B, what are some best practices that can be put in place, and what are the barest minimums? So that's what the trip in a box would be. It's a combination of, okay, this seems to happen most in these circumstances, and we think that this amount of breaks or water or whatever it is are appropriate. And we need to, I think it's an acknowledgement that we need to be realistic. We're going to have hotter and hotter days, and there's going to be weird other polar vortex environment, weather events, and workers deserve to be protected.
So, last question. It goes right to that point. What will be the impact of this bill on the workers if it passes? I mean, will they be more protected? Will they be more informed? Does this set the stage for them to be able to speak up in a future debate?
That's what the goal is, right? We envision a future with, perhaps a different president, perhaps a different budget scenario, and perhaps a statewide OSHA or a more robust federal OSHA. But we want to get to a place where these harms that occur to workers in extreme temperatures are prevented. I mean, that's really the ultimate goal, that you have a healthy workforce, because that's the case we're trying to make to businesses, that sick days and sick workers and workers' comp are all negative effects on business, and happy, healthy workers, given appropriate breaks, can work those long, hot days, and you will be an attractive employer.
Okay. Well, Representative Meg Froelich, one of the primary sponsors of House Bill 1272, thanks for the conversation. We'll be eager to see how this continues to evolve.
Thank you for having me.
And now we welcome to the interview chair Michael Gifford, the Advocacy Director for the Associated General Contractors of Colorado, one of the organizations that has taken a leading role in battling efforts over the past 2 years to pass extreme temperature legislation. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
Now, as the sponsor of the bill explained, this is quite a different bill from last year's version, but you and others are still opposed to this. So start by telling me broadly what bothers you about this year's bill.
Okay, and just to give a little context, last year we had a bill that was 27 pages long. It had a fiscal note, and this is important, that said 200,000 in last year, but this year 1.7 million was the estimate. So just to put that in context, that's a big whopping fiscal note in today's budget challenge. And that bill did not go forward, and we were proud to co-prime, if you will, the opposition campaign with the Colorado Chamber. You didn't ask me to say that, but we put together a big tent coalition, but we were proud to be at the tip of the spear with that. Now, this year's bill deals with still hot and cold temperatures, gathering data by the government, by the CDLE in the bill, and then writing a model trip report, and then having individual businesses also write that report, thousands of businesses. So there's a lot of cost in there, and there's still, to us, duplication of effort because we are still working under federal OSHA, which regulates all things safety, and it does. I think we heard one of the sponsors say this at a stakeholder meeting, that this is perceived by the proponents and the sponsors as not only a safety bill but a climate bill, bringing to light how climate changes are affecting employee safety. And while we understand that, we'd like to leave safety in its own bucket and climate action with the tens and dozens of bills that have been passed on that issue, and not kind of conflate the two. So that really is the thing in this current bill that we're concerned about, is having to make up these individual plans, and then once CDLE gets the data, they're to write training standards under a rulemaking, so we can't see what that is yet. And so we'd rather just stay under federal OSHA. But if we're going to have to do this kind of thing on temperatures, the other thing we want to keep in mind is that, for example, if you have a cold day at a ski area, and even though we're the construction industry, I'm using this example, the employee may not be able to work because it's too cold, so they can walk right around and get in the line at the ski lift and ski in that same temperature that they can't work in. And all the rest of the public is putting themselves in that temperature as well. So we do kind of think that there's um, a little bit of where the wheels fall off on this in terms of the extreme cold and hot temperatures, especially when you get into the mountain areas. So the other thing we often look for is the labor groups that we work with. And one of the groups would be the union building trades, and they are not active on this bill. They are on another bill this year that we may or may not be able to talk about, which is the House Bill 1054.
Oh, we talked about that in last week's episode.
Okay.
Don't you worry.
But, and labor is on that one, and you saw them be active the other night, but they're not being active on this bill. It's not coming from the construction union trades. So that kind of tells you something that they're, and I've talked to Jason Wardrop, who's the head of the building trades, and says, you know, working in those temperatures is something that they expect to do and they want to do it safely, but they don't have a problem doing that as long as the proper steps are taken.
And I'm curious, as long as we're talking about the proper steps being taken, do many of your members already have extreme temperature plans in place? And if so, I'm curious, like, how do individual companies approach working when it's hot or very cold?
So that is a great question. And first I want to let you know, because these are some little known facts, we have had a successful written partnership program with OSHA going back over 20 years. And in fact, personally, I've had these type of agreements going back into the 1990s with my previous stint as CEO of the Idaho AGC, and then coming here to Colorado. So a lot of experience with that. And so in that, we've also stood up one of only 28 OSHA training institutes in the country. So that means OSHA has looked at our safety training program and deemed it to be one of their official OSHA training institutes right here in Denver. So we are training on these topics. We have a written agreement, and what individual companies do is they provide warming opportunities when it's cold, and they provide shade and watering opportunities, and in both cases enough breaks to take advantage of those opportunities on a cold or a hot day at a construction site. So that's basically what they do, is already incorporate some of these trip plan kind of things into their individual construction project and construction company practices as part of their existing agreement with OSHA. But what we're finding is that there aren't a lot of, the proponents last year talked about emergency room visits, and about 500 emergency room visits. The vast majority of those are from citizens of the state out recreating, not from a work site, and certainly not from a construction site. So that's how we know that our current practices to address hot or cold days are working effectively.
I mean, and do you actually track that number as a sector? And if so, is it going up or down or staying steady?
So we were not tracking individual emergency room visits or work comp injuries for heat and cold vis-a-vis other types of injuries, but that's something that we're starting to do now. We don't have enough data to really draw a conclusion yet, but what we are able to do is, you know, there's another part of government that I think everyone's starting to figure out, already keeping track of this data over at CDPHE. So we're all accessing that data, and that's what we're using to know workplace versus non-workplace emergency room visits for heat and cold injuries.
And that kind of lends to the question. I mean, one of the things the bill does is require that the state collect data on extreme temperature injuries. Are you saying that's already being done?
Yes, although it's a different filter through the healthcare system. So one of the things that might be an opportunity, it's not in the bill currently, but we hear may be an opportunity, is to further enhance that existing effort versus having CDLE start it from scratch. And we think that would be a positive outcome, to have the government kind of count once and know all the things that are important to be counting in that area, because we do need to look at the data, and if there is a bigger problem, then of course it does need to be addressed. But we don't see anything in the data now that points at hot and cold at work as being the problem versus not at work.
Okay, interesting. There's a potential area of compromise. I'm curious, one of the things that, as you mentioned, it also does in its introduced form is it pushes the state to develop a model temperature-related injury and illness prevention plan, and then to later develop training standards around this. Is this aspect of the bill problematic?
The model plan, we don't know if it's problematic because we don't know what's in the plan. I think that the training could be problematic if it's all new duplicate training than what we're already doing. Now, if the state comes up with some training and we can get federal OSHA to buy off on it and make that our training, then it's not duplicate, but all that's kind of unknown. So we always, in our business, have to price unknown risk to make sure that we can still deliver, a product at the end of the day to our developer, to our upstream government client. So we'd want to know more about what that's going to look like, but we'd really like to still only do one set of training that is bought off on by federal OSHA, because that's super important to us.
Okay.
That is still the main safety regulator in Colorado. By the way, there's 28 states 27 states in Puerto Rico that have a state OSHA, and there's 23 states that have federal OSHA. So, there's different ways that we're in the group of 23 states, but that's one thing we talked about previously is it seems like we're starting to see these bills about the state wanting to get in the safety business, and that may come to a time when we have to ask the larger question: should the state take over OSHA in total? But as you know, that would be very expensive.
And let me actually kind of finish this with that kind of larger question, because like I mentioned, just last week on the podcast, we featured an interview with one of the primary sponsors of this bill, talking about that separate legislation on OSHA, in which she said about both that bill and this bill that the state needs to step up to the moment and take responsibility for protecting workers as the federal government steps back from its oversight. Is there, in your sector's opinion, a case to be made there? Are workers being left without enough government protections right now?
Our answer to that is a simple no. OSHA still has the general duty clause. They still have focused programs. An example of focused program would be if you're up on a roof, you have to be tied off. So if you fall, you don't hit the ground. Okay. So all of that is still in place. Over time, and my career goes back a long time. I won't say how long, but there's been an ebb and flow as to the federal budget for safety. The rules don't go away, but the number of inspectors go up and down. But I do believe that there is some concern about the current administration in Washington, D.C., and are they going to scale things back? So I think what's happening is there's a desire here to get ahead of that, but we have not seen that in the area of OSHA. There may be peelbacks on environmental regulations for gas versus electric batteries, or natural gas versus solar and wind, but we haven't seen that come yet to the OSHA area specifically.
All right. Michael Gifford, Advocacy Director for the Associated General Contractors of Colorado and a longtime fixture at the state capitol. Thank you for joining us for this conversation today about employees working in hot and cold temperatures.
Thanks, Ed.
That's it for our interview segment. Now let's take a quick look at what you need to know about the week ahead. And once again, we are spotlighting 5 hearings that you will want to know about this week. Monday at 1:30 p.m., the House Finance Committee hears 3 of the 4 bills that Democrats are pushing for tax reform this year. House Bill 1221 limits use of net operating loss deductions and the executive compensation deduction. House Bill 1222 decouples state tax law from several recently signed federal tax breaks. And House Bill 1223 removes the sales tax exemption on downloadable software. All 3 of these bills would put the new tax revenue they generate toward expanding family affordability tax credits. But business groups like Colorado Chamber of Commerce are opposing all 3 bills, saying they will make the state less competitive for job growth. The hearing is scheduled for the old Supreme Court chambers. On Wednesday morning, upon House adjournment, the House Business Affairs and Labor Committee will hear House Bill 1273, which would prohibit transportation network companies like Lyft and Uber from keeping more than 20% of the revenues from each ride, ensuring that drivers get the rest of the take. This is one of several bills that look to regulate this already regulated market further this year. The hearing is slated for House Committee Room 112. That same afternoon at 1:30, the House Health and Human Services Committee will hear the bill that is the subject of this week's episode, the bill to protect workers laboring in extreme temperatures. I will add that this is a bill that business groups like the Colorado Chamber oppose. It is set to be heard in House Committee Room 112. Also on Wednesday afternoon at 1:30, the House Transportation, Housing, and Local Government Committee is scheduled to hear House Bill 1211, which would allow the Public Utilities Commission to regulate broadband as a public utility, a bill supported by consumer advocates but opposed by business groups like the Colorado Chamber. This hearing will take place in Legislative Services Building, Room A. And finally, on Thursday at 1:30 p.m., the House Business Committee will hear House Bill 1210, which would prohibit employers and online retailers from using surveillance of internet data to determine wages or to determine pricing of their goods. Another bill that is backed by those leery of the influence of big tech. This is opposed by business groups like the Colorado Chamber because of its potential consequences on ending things like loyalty club pricing or offers that are made to customers who don't initially buy a good or service. It will be in House Committee Room 112. That's all for this episode of Colorado Chamber Office Hours. Once again, I'm Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. I'll keep the conversation going at tsscolorado.com, and we'll see you next time as we explore the issues that matter most to business.